I helped my parents' business, which was led by my brother, by giving him a reliable contract. My brother broke the terms and lost it. "You set this all up," he shouted. "You deliberately handed me that client just to ruin my business." Back then, I thought it would all end there, but the next morning I received a court summons. So here's the thing about being the second kid in a Midwestern family. You're basically invisible until you mess something up. My name's Thomas, and I've been living in my older brother David's shadow since I could walk. Born and raised in Iowa, where corn grows taller than dreams and everyone knows your business before you do. David was everything parents brag about at church potlucks. Star quarterback in high school, full ride to Iowa State. Came back home with a business degree and that confident smile that made everyone think he could turn water into profit. Me? I was the kid who fixed things quietly, worked weekends at the auto shop, and never complained when Mom forgot to mention my honor roll achievements because she was too busy talking about David's latest accomplishment. Growing up, our dinner table conversations were basically David highlights with occasional weather updates. Dad would lean back in his chair, beer in hand, talking about how David was going to take over the family trucking business someday. Not us, not we, just David. I'd sit there pushing mashed potatoes around my plate, wondering if I was adopted or just cursed with being born second. The family trucking company wasn't much to look at back then. 3 semi-trucks, a tiny office that smelled like diesel and burnt coffee, and a client list you could fit on a napkin. But it was ours, passed down from Grandpa Joe, who started hauling grain back in the 70s. Dad always said it would stay in the family, though apparently family meant the golden child, not the spare. When I turned 25, something shifted. Maybe it was a recession hitting our small town hard, or maybe Dad finally realized that David's big city ideas weren't translating into hometown success. Either way, he called us both into the office one gray February morning that felt like the world was holding its breath. The conversation was awkward as hell. Dad fidgeted with his coffee mug, avoiding eye contact like he was about to tell us Santa wasn't real. He explained how the business needed fresh energy, how maybe it was time to let the next generation take the wheel. But here's the kicker. He wanted us to run it together as partners. David's reaction was exactly what you'd expect. That practiced smile spread across his face as he started talking about expansion plans, new routes, modernizing the fleet. He was already mentally redecorating the office before Dad finished explaining the partnership terms. Me? I just nodded and tried to process the fact that for once in my life, I wasn't being asked to play backup. The paperwork made it official, 50-50 partners in Morrison Brothers Trucking. Equal shares, equal say, equal responsibility. On paper, anyway. Reality had different plans, and David wasn't about to let a legal document change the natural order of things. Those first few months were like watching a slow-motion train wreck. David immediately positioned himself as the face of the company, taking meetings with potential clients while I handled the grunt work, scheduling drivers, maintaining equipment, dealing with the Department of Transportation paperwork that could give you nightmares. Every time someone called asking to speak with the owner, the receptionist would transfer them to David. When local business groups invited us to networking events, David went alone, introducing himself as the head of Morrison Brothers Trucking. I started feeling like the hired help in my own company. The breaking point came during a client meeting with Harvest Gold Foods, the biggest agricultural distributor in 3 counties. We'd been chasing their contract for months. It would triple our revenue overnight. I'd done all the research, calculated routes, worked out pricing that would beat every competitor while still keeping us profitable. David walked into that meeting like he'd personally built every truck in our fleet. He presented my research as his own insights, took credit for the cost-saving strategies I developed, and charmed the Harvest Gold executives with stories about his vision for the company's future. Not our vision, his vision. Sitting in that conference room, watching my brother perform like he was running for mayor, I felt something die inside me. It wasn't anger exactly, more like the quiet grief you feel when you finally accept that someone you love will never see you as an equal. The executives were impressed, nodding along as David painted himself as the innovative leader who would revolutionize their shipping needs. We got the contract. David celebrated by taking the clients out for drinks, posting photos on social media of himself shaking hands and making toasts. I went home to an empty apartment and ate leftover pizza while staring at the legal documents that supposedly made us equal partners. The final straw wasn't even a big moment. It was small and stupid and perfect in its cruelty. I was in the office late one evening, going over maintenance schedules, when I overheard David on the phone with our accountant. He was laughing about something, that easy confidence in his voice that I'd envied my whole life. Then I heard him say it, casual as commenting on the weather, how I was basically just handling the boring stuff while he ran the real business. How I was useful for keeping the trucks running but wasn't cut out for the strategic thinking that actually mattered. He actually used the phrase "my little brother" like I was still 10 years old, asking for help with homework. I sat there in the dark office, surrounded by invoices and maintenance logs, and made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to argue or fight or try to prove myself worthy of respect I should have had from day one. I was going to leave, start fresh, and build something that belonged to me alone. The next morning, I walked into David's office and quit my own company. His confusion was almost funny. He genuinely couldn't understand why I'd want to leave such a good situation. After all, I had a steady job, decent pay, and the privilege of working alongside such a successful entrepreneur. I cleaned out my desk while he watched, probably wondering who would handle all the detail work he'd never bothered to learn. The receptionist looked shocked. I'd been the reliable one, the guy who showed up early and stayed late, who knew every driver's name and every client's shipping preferences. Walking out of that building for the last time, carrying my personal items in a cardboard box like some corporate cliche, I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time since childhood, I was about to find out what Thomas Morrison could accomplish when he wasn't living in someone else's shadow. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a story that would test everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and what happens when the second son finally decides to come first. Starting your own trucking company with a maxed-out credit card and wounded pride is exactly what they teach you in business school. But that's exactly where I found myself 3 weeks after walking out of Morrison Brothers Trucking. I had $3,700 in savings, a used pickup truck, and enough stubborn determination to power a small city. The first step was finding a truck I could actually afford. Used semi-trucks are like dating in your 40s. Everything decent costs more than you want to spend, and everything in your price range has issues you don't discover until it's too late. I spent 2 weeks hitting every truck lot within 300 miles, listening to salesmen explain why their particular piece of machinery was worth twice what I had to spend. Finally found my beauty at a lot outside Des Moines. She was a 2008 Peterbilt that had seen better decades, with paint fading like an old photograph and enough miles on the odometer to make NASA jealous. The dealer, a guy named Rick who looked like he'd been selling trucks since the Carter administration, swore she ran like a dream. For $12,000, she better run like she was escaping prison. The financing was creative. To put it nicely, Rick knew a guy who specialized in helping folks with more ambition than assets. The interest rate made loan sharks look generous. But I signed those papers with the desperation of a man who had already burned his bridges and needed to prove he could swim. Getting my operating authority and insurance was like navigating a maze designed by bureaucrats having a bad day. Forms that referenced other forms, permits that required permits, and enough acronyms to choke a government official. DOT numbers, MC numbers, US.dot registration. It felt like joining a secret society where a handshake was replaced by paperwork. I set up shop in my apartment, which suddenly became the world's smallest trucking company headquarters. My kitchen table served as dispatch central, my living room doubled as a filing system, and my bedroom became the accounting department. The neighbors probably thought I'd lost my mind, talking to myself about delivery schedules and fuel costs at all hours. The first few months were brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. Sure, I expected long hours of financial stress, but nobody warns you about the loneliness. Driving cross-country by yourself gives you too much time to think, and most of my thoughts involved wondering if I'd made a catastrophic mistake. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. When I wasn't driving, I was cold calling potential customers, underbidding established companies just to get a foot in the door. I'd park at truck stops and work my phone until the battery died, then plug into the cigarette lighter and keep calling until my voice gave out. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected place, a conversation with another driver at a Flying J in Nebraska. Old-timer named Frank who'd been hauling freight since before GPS existed. He mentioned how his regular company had been letting him down lately, missing pickups and treating drivers like disposable income. Frank gave me a lead on a regional furniture manufacturer looking for reliable transport. Small loads, nothing glamorous, but steady work for someone who could prove dependable. I underbid their current carrier by 15% and promised personal service, meaning I'd be the one driving their freight, not some random contractor they'd never met. That furniture contract became my lifeline. 3 loads per week, consistent routes between Iowa and Illinois, enough income to make truck payments and buy groceries that didn't come from gas stations. I started building a reputation one delivery at a time, arriving early and treating every shipment like it contained the crown jewels. Word spreads fast in small-town business circles. The furniture manufacturer mentioned my service to their suppliers, who mentioned it to their distributors, who happened to know companies looking for reliable shipping. My phone started ringing with actual opportunities, instead of just bill collectors and concerned family members. Meanwhile, I kept hearing stories about Morrison Brothers trucking through the local business grapevine. Nothing concrete, just whispered conversations about missed deadlines, unhappy customers, and drivers quitting faster than they could be replaced. Part of me felt vindicated. Maybe I hadn't been crazy to leave. Part of me worried about Dad, who'd invested his whole life in that company. David, according to mutual acquaintances, was expanding aggressively. New trucks, bigger contracts. Talk about opening locations in neighboring states. On paper, it looked like success. But I'd learned enough about the trucking business to know that rapid expansion without solid fundamentals was like building a house on quicksand. 6 months into my solo venture, I hired my first driver. Jenny was a recent CDL graduate, looking for someone willing to train her properly instead of just throwing her the keys and hoping for the best. She reminded me of myself, hungry to prove herself, tired of being underestimated, and willing to work twice as hard as anyone expected. Adding Jenny meant I could take on more contracts, but also meant payroll responsibilities, insurance complications, and the terrifying realization that someone else's livelihood depended on my business decisions. Success wasn't just about proving David wrong anymore. It was about building something sustainable and meaningful. By the end of my first year, I had 3 trucks, 2 full-time drivers, and enough regular customers to sleep more than 4 hours per night. The business had a name, Heartland Express Solutions, and an actual office space in a converted warehouse on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. The financial stress hadn't disappeared, but it had evolved from panic into manageable anxiety. I still worried about making payments and keeping customers happy, but now those worries felt productive instead of paralyzing. Every challenge overcome made the next one seem less impossible. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning in late fall, leaves turning golden outside my office window, when David's voice crackled through my cell phone. He sounded different, less confident, more desperate, asking if we could meet for coffee. The conversation was awkward, filled with long pauses and careful words. He explained how Morrison Brothers was facing some challenges, how maybe he'd underestimated certain aspects of running a trucking company. The golden boy was asking for help, and for the first time in our lives, I held all the cards. Meeting David at Murphy's Diner felt like stepping into a parallel universe. This was the same booth where we'd celebrated his high school graduation, where Dad had announced his retirement plans, where family decisions got made over coffee and pie. But now the dynamic was completely flipped. David looked tired in a way I'd never seen before. His usual press shirts had been replaced by wrinkled polo. His confident posture slumped like a deflated balloon. When he ordered just black coffee instead of his usual full breakfast, I knew things were worse than he'd let on over the phone. The story came out slowly, like pulling teeth from someone who'd spent his whole life being the one with answers. Morrison Brothers had expanded too fast, taken on contracts they couldn't handle properly, and developed a reputation for unreliability that was poisoning their relationships with long-term customers. 3 major clients had canceled contracts in the past month alone. The Harvest Gold deal the one David had celebrated so publicly, had become a nightmare. Their demanding delivery schedules required coordination skills that looked easy in David's presentations, but proved nearly impossible in reality. Missed pickups, late deliveries, and damaged goods had turned their biggest contract into their biggest liability. Sitting across from my brother, watching him struggle with words like failure and mistakes, I felt something I hadn't expected: genuine sympathy. This wasn't the cocky golden child who dismissed my contributions. This was someone drowning in responsibilities he'd never learned to handle, finally understanding what I'd been doing quietly for years. But underneath the sympathy, I'd be lying if I said there wasn't satisfaction. Sweet, complicated satisfaction at seeing the natural order disrupted. The brother who'd never doubted his superiority was asking for help from the backup he'd taken for granted. David's request was simple on the surface. He needed introductions to reliable subcontractors who could handle overflow work while he rebuilt his operation. Nothing that would compromise my own business. Just connections to help stabilize Morrison Brothers until they could get back on solid ground. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. I'd spent 2 years building the network of drivers and logistics coordinators that David now desperately needed. The relationships he dismissed as unimportant were exactly what could save his company. I agreed to help, not because I owed him anything, but because it felt like the right thing to do. Family complications aside, watching someone fail spectacularly doesn't feel as good as you imagine it will. Besides, helping David succeed wouldn't diminish my own achievements. If anything, it proved how valuable my skills really were. The introduction I arranged was with Marcus Williams, a veteran logistics coordinator who ran a small but efficient operation out of Cedar Rapids. Marcus specialized in emergency freight solutions, the kind of reliable backup that kept companies afloat during crisis situations. He was expensive but worth every penny. The meeting between David and Marcus went smoothly, largely because I prepared both sides for what to expect. Marcus got a client who desperately needed his services. David got a lifeline that could handle the overflow causing his biggest headaches. Simple business transaction that benefited everyone involved. For a few weeks, it looked like the plan was working. David's social media posts resumed their optimistic tone, talking about strategic partnerships and operational improvements. Marcus reported that Morrison Brothers was paying promptly and providing accurate shipping information, which was more than many established companies managed. I should have known it wouldn't last. David's fundamental problem wasn't logistics or capacity. It was his inability to handle criticism and adapt when reality didn't match his expectations. The same arrogance that had made him dismiss my contributions was about to destroy the help I'd arranged. The first sign of trouble came when Marcus called me directly instead of going through David. Apparently, there had been disagreements about pickup schedules, with David insisting that Marcus adjust his operations to accommodate Morrison Brothers' promises rather than realistic timelines. Marcus, being a professional with 30 years of experience, had tried explaining why certain delivery schedules were impossible given the distances and regulations involved. David's response was to lecture him about customer service and demand that he find ways to make the impossible happen. The breaking point came during a particularly stressful week when multiple shipments were delayed due to winter weather. Instead of communicating honestly with customers about the delays, David had promised Marcus could solve problems that physics and Department of Transportation regulations made unsolvable. When Marcus finally called to end the partnership, his frustration was obvious even through his professional politeness. He'd dealt with demanding clients before, but David's combination of unrealistic expectations and condescending attitude had pushed him past his tolerance limit. The conversation with David afterward was predictably explosive. Instead of acknowledging his role in destroying a valuable partnership, he immediately looked for someone else to blame. And naturally, that someone was me. According to David's version of events, I had deliberately set him up with a subcontractor who couldn't handle the demands of serious business. Marcus Williams wasn't a professional logistics expert. He was some small-time operator I'd chosen specifically to make David look bad. The accusation was so absurd, I almost laughed. Marcus had handled freight for companies 10 times larger than Morrison Brothers, with a reputation for reliability that spanned decades. But David needed someone to blame for his failures, and admitting his own mistakes wasn't his vocabulary. Our phone conversation escalated quickly from explanation to argument to full-blown shouting match. David accused me of sabotaging his business, of orchestrating his problems out of jealousy and revenge. I tried explaining what had really happened, but he wasn't interested in facts that contradicted his victim narrative. The call ended with David promising that he wouldn't let me destroy everything our family had built. At the time, I thought it was just angry words from someone having a breakdown. I had no idea he was already planning his next move, one that would drag our family dispute into a courthouse and force everyone to choose sides. Getting served with a lawsuit while eating breakfast cereal in your pajamas isn't how anyone expects their Tuesday morning to start. The process server was polite enough, apologizing for the early hour, while handing me papers that accused me of tortious interference, conspiracy, and intentionally destroying my brother's business. Reading through David's legal filing was like entering an alternate reality where I become some kind of criminal mastermind. According to his lawyer, I'd orchestrated an elaborate scheme to steal clients, spread false rumors, and systematically undermine Morrison Brothers, trucking out of spite and jealousy. The specific allegations would have been funny if they weren't so serious. David claimed I had contacted his customers pretending to offer better rates, that I bribed drivers to quit at crucial moments, and that my introduction to Marcus Williams was part of a calculated plan to sabotage his operations from within. None of it was true, but David had assembled circumstantial evidence that painted a convincing picture if you squinted hard enough and ignored inconvenient facts. My business success coincided with his decline. Marcus had ended their partnership after I made the introduction. Former Morrison Brothers drivers now work for companies I'd recommended them to. The worst part wasn't the legal accusations. It was watching our family choose sides. Mom called the day after the lawsuit became public, her voice tight with disappointment. She didn't directly accuse me of anything, but her questions made it clear she was struggling to believe David would lie about something so serious. Dad was more direct. Years of trusting David's judgment had convinced him that his golden child wouldn't file a frivolous lawsuit. In his mind, where there was smoke, there was fire, and I must have done something to provoke such drastic action. The preliminary hearing was a nightmare of small-town drama. Everyone who mattered in our local business community seemed to be there, watching the Morrison brothers air their dirty laundry in front of a judge. I sat next to my lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Chun, who specialized in business disputes, try and project confidence I didn't feel. David's presentation was polished and convincing. He spoke about family betrayal, unfair competition, and the devastating impact my actions had on a business built over 3 generations. His lawyer painted me as a bitter sibling who couldn't accept his brother's success and had resorted to sabotage. When my turn came, Patricia methodically dismantled David's narrative with documentation and witness testimony. Phone records showing I'd actually recommended clients to Morrison Brothers during my early months in business. Text messages proving I'd tried to help David find qualified drivers when he was desperate. The Marcus Williams situation was particularly damaging to David's case. Marcus testified via video call, explaining exactly why he'd ended the partnership and providing detailed examples of David's unreasonable demands and condescending behavior. But the most powerful evidence was David's own business records, which Patricia had subpoenaed. The financial documents told a story of mismanagement that started long before I'd left the company. Overextension, poor cash flow management, and customer complaints dating back to when I was still handling operations. Watching David's face as Patricia presented his own company's records was like watching someone realize they'd been caught in a lie. His confident expression cracked, replaced by the panicked look of someone whose narrative was collapsing in real time. The cross-examination was brutal. Patricia walked David through specific incidents, asking him to explain discrepancies between his lawsuit claims and documented reality. When had I allegedly contacted his customers? Which drivers had I supposedly bribed? Where was any evidence of conspiracy he described? David's answers became increasingly vague and defensive. He couldn't provide dates, names, or specific evidence because none existed. His case was built on assumptions, hurt feelings, and a desperate need to blame someone else for problems he created himself. During a recess, I watched our parents sitting in the gallery, whispering to each other with worried expressions. Mom kept glancing between David and me, probably wondering how her sons had ended up as legal adversaries in a public courtroom. The local business community was getting quite a show. Competitors, suppliers, and customers all watching the Morrison family implode over accusations of sabotage and betrayal. Whatever happened with the lawsuit, our reputations would carry the scars of this public spectacle. Patricia's closing argument was masterful, weaving together the evidence into a clear picture of what had really happened. A struggling business owner, faced with the consequences of poor management, had chosen to blame family rather than accept responsibility for his failures. She painted David's lawsuit as a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation by destroying mine, using the legal system as a weapon against someone whose only crime was succeeding after being underestimated and dismissed. The judge's questions during deliberation suggested he was skeptical of David's claims. He asked pointed questions about the lack of concrete evidence, the timing of various allegations, and why David hadn't addressed these supposed issues before filing suit. Sitting in that courtroom, waiting for a decision that could destroy the business I'd built and the reputation I'd earned, I realized something important. Win or lose, I wasn't the same person who'd quietly accepted being treated as second best. I'd fought back, stood up for myself, and refused to be a victim of someone else's failures. The judge called for a final recess before announcing his decision. As we waited, David approached me in the courthouse hallway, looking smaller somehow than he had at the beginning of this whole mess. For a moment, I thought he might apologize, might admit that things had gotten out of hand. Instead, he just looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read and walked away. Whatever happened next, I knew our relationship had crossed a line it could never uncross. Some damage can't be undone, even by court decisions. Judge Harrison cleared his throat and adjusted his reading glasses, the sound echoing through the packed courtroom like a gunshot. Everyone leaned forward, family members, business associates, curious townspeople who'd been following the Morrison brothers saga like their favorite soap opera. The decision was swift and decisive. David's lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning he couldn't refile the same claims again. The judge's reasoning was equally blunt. There was no credible evidence supporting any of the allegations, and the case appeared to be driven by personal grievances rather than legitimate legal claims. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. He went further than I'd expected, awarding me attorney's fees and costs, essentially punishing David for filing what the court considered a frivolous lawsuit. The message was clear. Using the legal system to settle family disputes based on hurt feelings wouldn't be tolerated. David's face went through several colors during the judge's statement, settling on a pale gray that matched his suddenly deflated posture. His expensive lawyer whispered something in his ear, probably explaining that appeals were unlikely to succeed given the complete lack of supporting evidence. Walking out of that courthouse felt like emerging from an underground tunnel into sunlight. Patricia Chin smiled and shook my hand, commenting that she'd rarely seen such a clear-cut case of someone shooting themselves in the foot. The business community members who'd attended gave me nods of respect that felt better than any trophy. But the victory was complicated by watching my family's reaction. Mom looked relieved but confused, like she couldn't quite process how wrong she'd been about the situation. Dad avoided eye contact entirely, probably struggling with the realization that his golden child had just been publicly humiliated for making false accusations. The local newspaper covered the story, though they kept it diplomatic with headlines about business dispute resolution rather than family betrayal. Still, everyone in town knew what had happened. David Morrison had accused his brother of sabotage and got thoroughly embarrassed in court when he couldn't prove any of it. My phone started ringing immediately after the verdict. Some calls were congratulations from fellow business owners who'd been quietly rooting for me. Others were potential clients who'd been watching the case and were impressed by how I'd handled the pressure without retaliating or playing dirty. The most unexpected call came from Frank, the old-timer trucker who'd given me my first lead 2 years earlier. He'd been following the court case and wanted me to know that word was spreading to the trucking community about how I conducted myself. Integrity under pressure was rare in any business, but especially valuable in an industry built on handshake agreements. Within a week, I had 3 new contract offers, including one from a company that had previously been exclusive with Morrison Brothers. They'd been looking for an excuse to switch carriers anyway, and the court case had given them confidence that Heartland Express Solutions was the more stable choice. David's business didn't survive much longer after the lawsuit. The legal fees, combined with continued operational problems and a reputation damaged by the public court proceedings, created a death spiral he couldn't escape. Morrison Brothers Trucking closed its doors 6 months later, selling its remaining assets to cover debts. Dad took the closure harder than anyone expected, watching 3 generations of family business disappear because of his son's mismanagement and legal miscalculations age him visibly. He started spending more time at Mom's kitchen table, staring out the window like he was trying to figure out where everything went wrong. The conversation I'd been dreading finally happened on a cold Sunday afternoon in March. David showed up at my office unannounced, looking like he'd lost 20 pounds and gained 20 years since the court case. His usual confidence was completely gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. He didn't apologize exactly, but he admitted that things had gotten out of hand. The lawsuit was a mistake, he said, filed out of desperation when everything was falling apart, and he needed someone to blame besides himself. It wasn't an excuse, just an explanation. What surprised me was realizing I wasn't angry anymore. Sitting across from this broken version of my brother, I felt something closer to pity than satisfaction. The golden child had fallen so far from grace that spite seemed pointless. His punishment was already complete. Public humiliation, business failure, and the knowledge that he destroyed everything through his own arrogance. I offered him a job. Not management, not partnership, just a driving position with good benefits and the chance to rebuild his reputation through honest work. He looked shocked, like he couldn't believe I'd help him after everything that had happened. David declined the offer, saying he needed to figure things out on his own terms. I respected that decision, even if I thought it was another mistake. Pride had gotten him into this mess, and apparently pride was going to dictate how he got out of it too. He did ask for one thing. Would I consider hiring some of his former drivers who were still looking for work? Good people who'd gotten caught up in his company's collapse through no fault of their own. I agreed immediately, and that small gesture seemed to mean more to him than any job offer could have. The years since the lawsuit have been good to Heartland Express Solutions. We're up to 15 trucks now, with a reputation for reliability that brings in steady business from across the Midwest. The company David said I'd never be able to run without him has become more successful than Morrison Brothers ever was. More importantly, I've learned something about success that David never understood. It's not about proving you're better than someone else or getting recognition for being the smartest person in the room. It's about building something solid, treating people fairly, and earning respect through consistency rather than charisma. Sometimes I wonder things could have been different if David had accepted that partnership as genuine equality instead of a threat to his status. Maybe we could have built something amazing together, combining his natural leadership with my operational skills. But that would have required him to see me as an equal, and I'm not sure he was ever capable of that. The second son finally got his chance to be first, and it turned out I didn't need anyone's permission to succeed. I just needed to stop waiting for recognition and start earning it on my own terms. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well, even when the person you're proving wrong is your own brother. Thanks for sticking with me through this whole crazy story. I know family drama can get messy and business disputes make it even worse, but sometimes you've got to share what happened to make sense of it all. What do you think about David's choices? Could this whole mess have been avoided, or was it inevitable once pride got involved? Let me know in the comments below. I actually read every single one. And if this story resonated with you, maybe hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life drama from small-town America. Your support keeps these stories coming. And trust me, I've got plenty more where this came from.